Welp, the fire background can only mean one thing. I'm covering a commentary on me again. This time from a user named Starmic. And let me just say, when his channel description not only praises, but also dead names Ray, I do not have very high apple pie in the sky hopes going into this, just so you guys know. Either way, everybody gets a fair chance to defend their points here, so let's listen to what he has to say. Oh, also, he's covering my commentary on Professor Dave, just so you all know.
Hey guys, it's been a while since I made a commentary.
Okay, is it just me, or does his avatar look like someone you'd find in a Panera about 8 years ago? Not an insult, just an observation.
Now, as promised, with the indictment of conservatives complete, I turn to liberals and the missteps they are enacting that are preventing resolution. Number 1, please stop saying things like gender is a social construct.
So, quick question to you, Professor. If the societal attitudes and roles created as a result of the observation of one's sex isn't a social construct, then what is it exactly? For that matter, if this is the case, then why have the concepts of masculinity and femininity differed so much throughout history? Just 1 century ago, pink was considered a masculine color and blue was considered a feminine color. Today, it's the exact opposite in most of the West. At this same point in history, white dresses were entirely gender neutral, as was the term girl, which simply referred to a young child, who would later turn into either a man or a lady. High heels are considered feminine in the West today, but once upon a time, they were actually invented for the purpose of archery, and were later co-opted by the aristocracy as a sign of wealth. A man who has sex with a lot of women today is considered to be a playboy, or a pickup artist, or something else along those lines, but in ancient Rome, he would have been considered unmasculine. In fact, in a lot of the 20th century, homosexuality was considered effeminate. In ancient Rome, having sex with women was considered feminine, and having sex with men was considered masculine. Well, if you wanted my sources, I'll give you them. The claims about pink previously being a masculine color, blue previously being a feminine color, white dresses previously being gender neutral, and high heels being a status of wealth came from this old video from Secular Talk, which covered this article from the Huffington Post. Another thing the article mentions that I actually forgot about until I reread it for this video is that cheerleading actually began life as a masculine sport. Women weren't even allowed to be included for the first couple of decades it existed, and it did not become female-dominated until the 1960s. Presidents Franklin Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, and Ronald Reagan all even engaged in the sport in their youth. The claim about girl previously being a gender-neutral term came from this video from Vosh. Now, I can't pinpoint the exact place I first heard what I said about Rome, but I will say that what I said is completely compatible with very mainstream common knowledge about how the Romans viewed sexuality. You see, the Romans didn't really view sexuality in terms of heterosexuality or homosexuality. They viewed it as passive or active. Being active was obviously considered more masculine than being passive. The Romans also adopted a very misogynistic culture from the Greeks. The Greeks primarily believed that women were essentially nymphomaniacs who needed to be subjugated, or else their unchecked, wild libido would destroy civilization. As such, a view began to grow that being an active with women still wasn't as masculine as being an active with men, because being an active with a woman was essentially on the same level as using a sex toy. And being a passive with women was basically the equivalent of being dominated by a sex toy. Like, how do you even do that? You want to look at all of this and tell me this isn't a social construct? Well, okay, you need a very persuasive argument for that, is all I'm going to say, and the best argument you've given is, I don't understand this, and it's really confusing. Which is a little hypocritical considering this video is specifically about stopping confusion, by the way. I know I already pointed that out, but I can't get over that.
No, it is not. It is a biological construct.
Out of curiosity, do you believe men evolved to hunt giraffes? Okay, why did you decide to include the second interjection there? Especially considering that was nothing more than a joke on my part that didn't add anything to the argument I was making in the interjection beforehand. Hell, considering the part you're arguing against is me saying that he's wrong to say gender isn't a social construct, you could have cut me off like 15 seconds before you did. It's not a big deal, but it is noticeable.
Roman Tater, he never said that societal attitudes and roles created as a result of the observations of one's sex isn't a social construct, because Dave himself already established his own definition of gender which doesn't include any of that, so this tangent doesn't really work here.
Okay, what is it with people who cover me and thinking I don't know the videos I cover, because this is the second time this has happened. I'm perfectly aware that Dave attempted to give his own definition of gender, however there are two issues with your claim that therefore makes my tangent incorrect. The first one being, I reject his definition of gender because it's utterly nonsensical. The most he gave was that it's complicated, which isn't a definition. If I ask you what calculus is, and you tell me complicated, you haven't told me what calculus is. There's also the fact, and this is something else I point out in the commentary, that his definition was essentially pulled out of his ass. It's something he made up on the spot so he could redefine gender in a specific way, basically just so he could say that it's not a social construct. Using the actually universally accepted definition of gender shows that it is. And that's what I was using when I was responding to him.
Whether or not Dave's idea of gender holds water, we already know where his premise for the claim that gender is not a social construct stems from.
Yeah, and I don't accept his notion, hence why I was ignoring it for this point. Here's a question, Starmic. If I were to commentate on an alchemist, would I be required to respond to his methods of turning lead into gold in a way that accepts the idea that you can do that? Well, obviously not, because you can't. I am going to stick to reality while addressing pseudoscience. And Dave's definition of gender is pseudoscience.
But that's not the biggest problem here actually. Fun fact, I watched Professor Dave's video before this commentary existed and I remembered a point where Professor Dave mentions gender roles and gender expectations.
Gender roles are a social construct. That all men must be this way and do these things, and all women must be this way and do these things, that is a social construct, and it is one that became obsolete immediately upon evolving beyond a hunter-gatherer society. It has only persisted due to deeply rooted misogyny and the desire to treat women as private property. Rage against gender roles as a social construct all you like. I'm right there with you. But stop saying that gender itself is a social construct.
In Dave's eyes at least, everything you described here would fall under gender roles and gender expectations, in which you yourself implied with the statement societal attitudes and roles created as a result of the observations of one's sex. So yeah, your point here fails since we know he believes those things are a social construct. What's suspicious here is that this part of his video is completely cut out from your commentary. It can come across as dishonest, so make sure not to do this in the future. I'm not going to accuse you of doing anything malicious, as it could just be an oversight, or maybe I'm completely off base here.
You're not going to say that I did it for malicious reasons, you're just gonna heavily imply it. It was suspicious after all, but not malicious, not malicious. No, nobody said it was malicious. But to tell you why I cut it out, it's because, to be honest, I didn't have anything to say about it. Although, looking back, I really should have said something about it, because that doesn't make any sense considering gender roles flow from gender. Saying that gender is not a social construct, but gender roles are, is essentially on the same level as saying that 2 + 2 is biological, but 4 is a social construct. That doesn't make any sense. As for the rest of your point, well, it falls apart for the same reason it fell apart before. I don't particularly care what Dave thinks, because Dave is wrong. My commentary exists to argue that his views on gender are wrong. Telling me that actually David correctly understood gender, but he just called it this other thing, is a complete non sequitur, because it doesn't address my actual point. My final thoughts are, this wasn't a terrible one-shot by any means, but you missed the point of my point, and that's really all I have to say. So good night, and good luck.